Okay. We got a few announcements here before our meet and greet time. And okay, so I'm just going to run through these real quick. So pay attention. We have out of date food. That's right. That's what kind of church we are now. Well, we're not allowed, and we shouldn't be allowed to hand out food that is expired, of course, in our food pantry. And so we have some food that has expired, and it's out in tables back there. And it's between you and the good Lord if you want to take your chances on that. Sometimes food is good for a long period of time after its expiration date. I took a couple things home. So if some of those things appeal to you, it's against in that back room over there on tables. Just take whatever you want or need, because we'll have to throw out what doesn't get used. I mean, they're not like 10 years out of date. They're like 6 months out of date. So okay, small groups are next week. Our small groups, if you haven't been a part of one or don't know what they are, they're very small and very quick. They're right after the church service. Usually I try to end the service a little earlier to give a little extra time. And there's usually 1 or 2 questions, and we sit in a circle and we just each person takes 5 or 6 minutes and answers the question. They've been really interesting to learn about each other in this ways. We've had questions like, now I'm blanking. Ray, what have some of our questions been? What brought you to Cornerstone? Where are you from? What's that? How you came to faith? Yeah, things like this. Things that you can hopefully give a brief answer to, but questions that are meaningful and matter. So next week, that's next week, and invite you all to join us next week in that. And thank you, Ray, for organizing that. Oh, One Winter Night, right? Okay. Just with regard to One Winter Night, it's these things kind of go up and down in waves in terms of fundraising in the community. Last year, One Winter Night is the fundraising event for See You at Home, which is the local homeless shelter for men and women. And last year they had a tremendous year. They raised over 500,000. I don't remember the exact amount, but it was they did very well. They were trying to do 500,000 again this year, especially because they've added to their shelter a number of things, expanded. And right now, as of this morning, when I checked, they were at 72%. They had like $336,000. So they still got a ways to go. And they are still taking money for One Winter Night. I think for like 2 weeks after the event, they counted towards that night. So if you haven't given yet, and a couple of you actually talked to me this morning that you want to give to Amelia and I for our half night for One Winter Night. Hopefully you won't give half checks. We tried. But I just, also I wanted to say with regard to that, it warmed my heart, no pun intended, just to see, that Cornerstone is such an integral part. We're a small church. Hope that doesn't come as a shock to anyone. One of the smaller churches in Champaign-Urbana, and we're sort of involved at a number of different levels at the shelter. And I appreciate that. I guess I just want to say thank you. I mean, that means a lot to me as a pastor. There are many things that churches can get involved in and choose not to get involved in. There's many ministries. I do have a sort of an almost legalistic sense of every church should be involved in some way to the ministry to the least of these, which I interpret as literally those people who don't have a roof over their heads or food on their, people who have literally nothing. I think churches are morally obligated to have some, something to do with that for people who are at the end of the rope in our community. So I'm just grateful, and I'm grateful for there were other people from other churches, other people of faith there too. It's a work of the body of Christ. And I'm also grateful that See You at Home does a fantastic job, in my opinion, of not just making it a work of the body of the Christ. They invite in all people from all backgrounds of, atheists or Muslim or what have you, whoever it is. People are welcome to come and join and serve in that capacity and do. So I was full of a lot of gratitude, even though I was a tad chilly that night. Okay, and then Elizabeth, you had yeah.
I just had a quick announcement from Jess, who is in the process of moving. And so if anyone is available at 1 today to help her finish up the last of the boxes. So it's pretty much just moving boxes to a storage unit. She said she has about 3 or 4 carloads full. So if she can get some folks to help, that would just go pretty quick. So maybe come up after church and organize with Jess. She can get you her address and all that good stuff if you'd like to help.
And in case anyone's confused, Jess is on the computer there. She's on Zoom.
Okay.
She's with us.
I'm just Jess.
Yeah, that's right, Jess. Yeah, good. Yeah, okay, thank you, Elizabeth. Okay, take 5 and say hello to someone you haven't said hello to for quite a while, or someone you don't know. Break, and then we'll come back in a minute. So we're continuing in the book of Revelation. And we are in the first couple chapters where the Lord has these messages for these churches. There's 7 churches, 7 letters that he's giving these messages through his servant John and to these churches. And we're at the church in Smyrna. If you're using the blue, I was going to say pew Bible, we don't have pews, the blue chair Bible, it's actually page 838, starting in chapter 2, verse 8. My message this morning is going to be very simple. I'm not doing a lot of exegesis, which is to say I'm not doing a lot of unpacking the various symbols or cultural background of this particular passage. My message is going to be much more simple and a little more pointed. It has a bit of an old man rant in the middle, but ends graciously, I hope. So you can tell me if I succeeded in that or not. But let's go ahead and read the passage to start off with. Just a reminder here, so those are the 7 churches in Asia Minor, modern day Turkey. And last week we did Ephesus, and we've gone a little bit north to Smyrna, which was a city that was almost as big as Ephesus. It was sort of a contender for the main city in Asia Minor, a very large and commercial town, as you can, similar to Ephesus in that regard. Oops, wrong way. Okay, and here I just I downloaded. As you can see, there's still ruins in Smyrna from this time period. And this is the remains of the Agora marketplace. So you can see how big a space that would have been. If you can imagine a roof and hundreds, maybe thousands of people doing business in that area. So this is the message here. To the angel of the church in Smyrna, write, these are the words of him who is the first and the last, who died and came to life again. I know your afflictions and your poverty, yet you are rich. I know about the slander of those who say they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. Do not be afraid of what you are about to suffer. I tell you, the devil will put some of you in prison to test you, and you will suffer persecution for 10 days. Be faithful, even to the point of death, and I will give you life as your victor's crown. Whoever has ears, let them hear what the Spirit says to the churches. The one who is victorious will not be hurt at all by the second death. Thank you, Elizabeth. So a couple things just to start off. It ends with that referring to the second death. And that, of course, comes at the end of the book of Revelation, which is that lake of fire, the infamous lake of fire that people fall into or thrown into, rather, and that is called the second death. That's what he's referring to here in this message. Now, each of these letters starts off with, so it says that, to the angel of the church and such, and then there's a description of Jesus. So he describes himself in each letter. And the description of himself is always, at least in part, an answer to the problem that they are having as a church. So I'll say it again. Jesus' description of himself at the beginning of these letters is an answer to whatever problems or issues that they are having as a church, which I find to be interesting as a Christian, just to think about a description of Jesus being a solution to my problems, a description of who the Lord is as being an answer to things which might be ailing me or my church, right? That just getting an accurate description of Jesus is powerful. An accurate description of Jesus has power, just as an inaccurate description of Jesus also has power, but of a negative sort, a destructive power, right? But an accurate description has a creative and loving power behind it. So this is what he says here. These are the words of him who is the first and the last. Sometimes we refer to that as the Alpha and the Omega. So that Jesus covers all time. In other words, it's sort of a perspective thing, right? The problems you're having right now, Jesus was around and ministering and powerful long before we were born, long before the world was born, in fact. If we won't go into Colossians or parts of Revelation, but that Jesus transcends time. And so, it takes away our anxiety, right? To think of God in that way, that he is the first and the last, and all things are covered by his presence. There's not a time and place where he does not exist or is not aware of. I am the Alpha and the Omega, who died and came to life again. I don't have to unpack that too much for you to know why this is of comfort to the Christians in Smyrna, who were incredibly vulnerable and were going to die. Some of them were going to die. Those 10 days of persecution that Jesus talks about there probably means 10 days of, yes, imprisonment, possible exile like John himself, and undoubtedly some people would be executed. It's not known the exact year. I've talked about this in previous sermons. We don't know exactly when the book of Revelation was written, exactly when he had this vision, probably under Domitian, who was reinstated the emperor's cult. The emperor's cult was when you had to worship the emperor as a god. And had been around for quite a while, but it tended to wax and wane depending on the emperor. And Domitian was like, you will worship me and my ancestors as gods, or you will be put to death. And so this is probably during that time. Actually, why not? Okay, I'll rabbit trail away. I'm coming back to this though. It's interesting for the Jewish people. Now the Jews learned very well. They learned to their core as people of faith from the Babylonian exile. They learned to have nothing to do with idolatry. What the Jewish people learned from the Babylonian exile was to fear God more than to fear the nations, right? They did learn that, and they learned it very well. And the Jewish people refused to worship Caesar, whether it was Nero or Domitian or whichever Caesar it was saying, you need to worship me, they would not. To their credit, they would not worship other gods. And so they were stubborn enough that an exception was carved out for the Jewish people. And what that exception was that, okay, so you don't have to worship me as God. You don't have to worship the emperor as God, but you do have to make sacrifices to the emperor, which is how it was one of the, back then, it's part of how you worship gods and make sacrifices. You have to make sacrifices to the emperor as a king, as your ruler. Okay, so almost in a secular sense, in a way, to use modern language. And so they carved out this exception for the Jews, which it seems by and large the Jews were willing to do, probably in part because they weren't terribly enamored with the king they had. They weren't big fans of the Herod clan, or who weren't even properly Jews. They were Idumeans, doesn't really matter, but they were willing to admit, sacrifice to the emperor, as a ruler. But they wouldn't sacrifice to him as a god. And it seems that the Christians were less than willing to do this, because Jesus was not just their God, he was their king. He was their ruler. He was the Messiah. He was the Davidic Messiah who came, the one who was promised, the King of Israel, right? And so they wouldn't. And they were mostly Jews at this time, although probably by now, probably more and more Greeks and non-Jewish people were becoming Christians. They certainly weren't, and not even probably, but a lot of them were still Jews. And the Romans considered Christians to be Jews, a Jewish sect, a heretical Jewish sect, if you will. And they often partnered with the Jewish people, and this gets into this text a little bit, to persecute the Christians. They hated the Christians for two very different reasons. Jewish people hated Christians for an entirely different reason than the Romans hated the Christians, but they both agreed that this was not a good thing, because Christians gave their whole life, their whole devotion, their whole worship to God and God alone, and to Jesus Christ as the Son of God, which was the problematic part for the Jewish people. So that's a little bit of background here. You can see what's happening here. And so we'll keep going here. Okay. The first and the last who died and came to life again. So Jesus is reminding them, death is not the end. It wasn't for me. It won't be for you. I know your afflictions and your poverty. So we know now that the church in Smyrna was probably poor, like literally quite poor, which makes sense. Money and power tend to go together even today. It did back then. I know your afflictions and your poverty, yet you are rich. And didn't we just sing that this morning with give thanks, right? Let the weak say I am strong. Let the rich say, let the poor say I am rich. I'll get it right. Let the poor say I am rich. You know, Jesus turned everything upside down with the Beatitudes. You know, the weak will be the strong ones. The humble will be the powerful. The poor will be rich. Everything is on its head. Everything's topsy-turvy. And he's reminding the church in Smyrna of that everything is upside down, and that's good. That's a blessing. That's good news. That's gospel. You are rich. You may be poor. You may be persecuted, but you have the gospel. You have me. You have me, the Alpha and the Omega. I know about the slander of those who say they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. He's saying, I know, I see what you're going through. I see your trouble. Now, I know for us, it makes us anxious, probably should make us anxious when we read passages like this and we see the words Jews and synagogue of Satan. We see a lot of these passages and things through the eyes of the Holocaust, through the eyes of anti-Semitism through the centuries, and it just makes us anxious because we don't want to say bad things about the Jews. Well, we don't want to say bad things about anybody, but this has a particular, it might have a point to it. You know, it might twinge a little. It's good to remember, and I don't think we can over-remind ourselves of this. This is a Jewish man having this vision, John, speaking or being spoken to by a Jewish Messiah, Jesus, who is the son of David, as Jewish as they get, talking about Jewish things. The notion of anti-Semitism in this passage would be a strange one. But there are Jewish people being referred to in this passage who are slandering the Christians, which is a bad, terrible thing. You know, I mean, we can't partition off any group of people from sin, right? We can't partition off Jewish people or Latinos or white people or any people from sin. We all sin, we all do terrible things. And this is an instance where a synagogue has slandered Christians. It doesn't say specifically what, but there's a few options. We know, for example, from Suetonius, who was a historian of the emperors, he wrote, he heard about the followers of, he wrote it as Christus, Christ. He had heard a rumor about this new religion, these followers, and he writes about it in his Lives of the 12 Emperors. I think that's what it's called. And he talks about how they were cannibals and they ate the flesh and blood of people. Again, a rumor, one that probably Jewish people and pagans alike would spread to, you know, discredit Christians. We know what they're talking about. We're about ready to go do it here in a few minutes, right? Communion. But you can see how that would be used as a slanderous libel, right? I mean, that's an easy one. And there's many others, but for whatever something is being said, or it could be that, you know, they're trying to subvert the empire, they're trying to subvert the emperor, which was not the case, right? Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, render unto God what is God's. Christians were not trying to subvert the empire. They just refused to worship the emperor. That it wasn't a revolt, it wasn't a revolution, it was just about fidelity. So, I know about the slander of those who say they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. Do not be afraid of what you are about to suffer. I tell you, the devil will put some of you in prison to test you. So he says, first of all, he says, don't be afraid. These are the terrible things that are about to happen. Don't be afraid. These are the terrible things that are about to happen. I think too often in the church, or even amongst friends who are Christians, we often say to each other, don't be afraid. God won't let that happen to you. Don't be afraid. There's no way that God would permit such a thing. Don't be afraid. Victory is yours in this world, is the parenthetical implied. And that's not true. Sometimes it just should be, don't be afraid. Jesus is the Alpha and the Omega, and he died and came to life. and you can die and come to life as well. Don't be afraid. Your eternal life is assured. We run into dangerous areas and we say, don't be afraid. This terrible thing won't happen to you. You'll be a miserable comforter of Job, right? The terrible things did happen, and they might happen to you. Amen, right? It's not a Disney song. You know, the gospel's more deeper than that. Don't be afraid of what you're about to suffer. I tell you, the devil will put some of you in prison to test you, and you will suffer persecution for 10 days. Be faithful, even to the point of death, and I will give you life as your victor's crown. Whoever has ears, let them hear what the Spirit says to the churches. The one who is victorious will not be hurt at all by the second death. And those are the promises that was given to the church in Smyrna. These problems continued in Smyrna for a while. Polycarp was a bishop in Smyrna. I don't know, maybe 100, 200 years later. I can't remember. Melody, do you know? I didn't write it down. Anyway, sometime later. And he was martyred in the streets of Smyrna, this bishop Bishop Polycarp, because, and we have a record of it, the Jewish people and the pagans got together and stormed, or rioted, basically, and dragged people out. And they burned Polycarp at the stake, which apparently didn't entirely kill him. So they then put a spear through him. Don't be afraid. It only lasts 10 days. That particular persecution only lasted 10 days. But there was more to come. Now, I said my message was very simple this morning, and it is, and that there was an old man rant in the middle, and there is. And it has to do with something I've already ranted to my wife about, so I have to apologize for a second rant that you've got to sit through. But I'm part of, I attended Regent College for seminary in Vancouver, and I'm part of a Facebook group of Regent alums. People post in there all the time. Some people I know, most of them I don't. Just Regent alums from over the years. Some are pastors, some aren't, but they post various things. And somebody posted recently an article from Christianity Today that was published on February 2nd, so just a few days ago. Well, and I've been studying the whole week this passage on Smyrna and also Pergamum, but I don't think we're going to get to Pergamum. And it's titled, I've Reached My Breaking Point as a Pastor. And one of my co-graduates attends this church where this person pastors, and she likes this pastor very much. And she posted this saying, well, basically, gosh, I hope he doesn't quit, right? Because she appreciates him so much as a pastor. And I found it terribly distressing. So I'm going to read it to you and share it with you. Hope you'll find it distressing with me, and then we can figure out a solution. Okay. A new Barna study discovered that 38% of pastors have given real serious consideration to quitting the ministry in the past year. I am one of that 38%. Spoiler alert, I am not, by the way. Even in the best of times, pastoral ministry has always felt like a broad and heavy calling. Fair enough. But the events of the past few years have made it a crushing one. The presidential election, unrest around racial injustice, a global pandemic that has taken the lives of over 800,000 Americans. Never before had I considered health protocols in the context of the church. But today, being too strict with health guidelines might damage the well-being of the church, while being too lax might take the life of a congregant. Pastors like me have to deal with the never-ending conversation about in-person versus online services and how to serve churchgoers without leaving behind the immunocompromised or disabled. All of this has injected a paralyzing degree of complexity and controversy into every single situation I face, every decision I make. And to make things worse, it feels as if everyone is on a hair trigger, ready to walk away at the merest hint that the church does not line up with their political or personal perspectives. Now, normally, pastors might rely on their personal relationships to navigate such fraught dynamics. But COVID-19 has taken that away as well, forcing us to rely on phone calls and video screens, which are no substitutes for physical presence. The situations are complex, the consequences weighty, the criticism unrelenting, and the path forward unclear. All of this has driven many pastors, including myself, to the breaking point. Goes on. That gives you a flavor. I can't read that and read about the church in Smyrna and think, dude, do you really believe that you're going to stand before your Lord and give an accounting of your ministry and be like, I had to use Zoom and I had to wear a mask, and that, there was politics and sometimes it got kind of tense? Jesus, do you know about how tense it can get with politics? I mean, are you really going to? Now, some people might be called to leave the ministry. In this whole article, and you can read it, I'll send a link if you want to read it, there's not a single mention of him praying about what Christ would have him do or whether he's really called to the ministry. Doesn't mention it. Just goes through all the things that he hates about being a pastor. And then, in fairness, at the end, ironically, he talks about God's hesed, God's loving kindness, steadfast love that is the same forever and ever, today and tomorrow. I mean, he has some good stuff in the end that I agree with. As pastors, you're supposed to reflect that steadfast loving kindness. You're not supposed to run when it gets hard unless you're called to. I mean, someone mentioned the other day, it was last week in the service, and it struck me. I don't think of myself as being a naturally faithful person. That's not something you want to hear your pastor say. But I'm not a naturally faithful person. Before I found the Lord, I was a naturally unfaithful person. But somebody mentioned something, because we're going down to Mississippi for Habitat for Humanity, and somebody said, well, how many times, Seth, have you gone? 50, 60 times? Who knows how many times you've gone? I didn't intend to go down every year for most of my adult life. That wasn't a plan that I had. I just felt like every year that was something that was good to do, needed to get done, that God had called me to do, and he hadn't called me to not do it, right, James? James and I were talking about this the other day. And so I'm going to keep doing it because that's part of God's steadfast love, the hesed. And if I'm called to do something else, I will. And that's what makes Christians unreliable, is that God might, what if God called me tomorrow to go minister in, I don't know, Rantoul or someplace? Well, you could still drive there, right? But North Dakota, let's say, I would go if I really felt that was God's call in my heart. So I'm unreliable in that way, but I'd really have to feel that call. I'd have to know that was God's call. I'm not just going to go because there's a better job with better pay, et cetera. And the thing is, everybody over the last couple of years has dealt with all these issues, and it's not specific to everything he wrote there. He's not going to be able to run away from that. How is he going to run away from that? That stuff is, unless he's planning on not attending church. I don't know how he's going to get away from it. He's just describing life. You pick any point in time in history. You think things were not political or stressed, or 9/11 or the Vietnam War, or, I don't know. There's always something. Satan's always ringing a bell. You're not going to get away from stress in any position, in any job. So maybe he's not called to be a pastor. But what really troubled me, because that Christianity Today published this article, and then people on Facebook who are commenting were just full of just all kinds of empathy and sympathy for this poor, poor man. And, he mentions actually towards the end of his, not related to him quitting the ministry, he mentions towards the end that his wife got cancer twice, recovered, but that they had, and that I feel. In fact, if he had written an article like, my wife has had cancer twice, I'm burned out as a caregiver, I have nothing left to give, sure. I'm sure the Lord is saying, take some time. But that wasn't even part of it was just all about, COVID and politics and things. And I just, I feel for this guy on one level, but on the other hand, I'm like, who said to you that this is what life was going to be like? Are you not preaching the same gospel I'm preaching? Don't be afraid. This persecution could lead to your death. So, okay, that's the gospel I'm reading. I don't have no sense of being persecuted. In fact, I was talking to somebody about this recently, but I have such a blessed life. How comfortable am I, right? And I can gather to worship here and not be, I have so many blessings. I can't imagine coming before the Lord and saying it was too hard. But that isn't unique to the reason and I'm going more in the grace. Old Man Rant is starting to. That's not unique to pastors, right? People leave churches, people leave the faith because it was too hard, too difficult, because people had different politics than they did, because people thought differently about the world than they did, because people weren't easy, people weren't simple. And Jesus wants us just to describe himself. Every single letter, every single beginning of those 7 letters to those churches starts with a description of Jesus. And so I can always say, I don't know if as a pastor or as a Christian, if I'm always making the best choices or if I'm doing the right thing. I can't say that with certainty. I can describe Jesus. I know he's the Alpha and the Omega. I know he died and rose again. And I know that I am not the Alpha and the Omega, but through him, I too can die and rise again and to walk with Christ for the rest of my life. What a prize is that? And if I believe it, I can withstand anything. So don't tell me bad things aren't going to happen. I'm sure they are. I don't know why I haven't had more bad things happen in my life. I've been blessed, so blessed. And every blessing is from God's hand. I know that. But I'm most blessed by truth. It's truth that blesses me. And the truth is, I don't know what tomorrow holds, and you don't know what tomorrow holds. But I hope it holds us together in the palm of the hand of Jesus. Amen. Amen. We'll go now to our time of communion. And if you're joining us for the first time, the communion table's in the back there, and it's his table, not ours. So we invite you to join us there.